Well, we're back in Florence, Italy. This was the second day of our stay there, and we had a desire to see Florence from above, and we picked a beautiful morning to take a walk across the Arno and up the hill towards San Miniato al Monte, which is a basilica that's high on a hill above Florence. This is the view that we had. It's really stunning because you can see Florence in its entirety. You can see these beautiful trees moving down towards the city and through the city. The morning light was beautiful on the buildings, and it was inspiring for us. And we sought to capture that this morning. We spent a good 3 hours in this location, painting, sketching, doing various views, and then we walked back down to have some lunch in the city. Anyway, the challenge of this sort of image is to simplify this sea of complex shapes and focus on a few. In my painting, you'll notice I'm starting with a very pale yellow ochre, and I'm going to sort of create the shape of the city of Florence with a focus on the duomo, a few of the larger buildings, a passage of trees in the foreground, and the mountains and sky behind. So the task is to, in my way of thinking, is to simplify this sea of tiled rooftops and buildings and avenues and basilicas into simpler shapes, at least in the beginning. There's always an opportunity for adding complexity as you move through the painting. But honestly, the painting will be stronger if you can maintain that sort of simplicity. This yellow ochre, if you notice, it's got the shape of the basilica. There's a lot of left whites, especially in the right-hand side. This is going to be a focal area, as well as the basilica, the duomo, which towers above the city of Florence. And I'm using this as a focal point because it will help me to express the bright light that's coming from the right-hand side and shining on the faces of some of the buildings. So here you see the shape of Florence as I'm going to paint it, basically with one color, but in that color you can see the buildings are starting to emerge already. Well, no hesitation here. I'm placing some strong greens in the foreground to emphasize the shape of the city. These greens are composed of some cad orange, some ultramarine blue, a little bit of neutral tint. And look, I would say, look at how I'm using the brush. I'm painting straight down using the tip of the brush to create the top of the trees. The brush is working for me to simplify these trees, simplify the shapes of the trees. And I very much want to keep this as a simple shape. So I'm going to work into it while it's wet, because I'm adding some strong darks and I don't want to create too many hard edges in the foreground. The foreground in a painting has a certain function. Generally, it's a lead-in to the main subject or the midground. And in this case, I want to use some darks, but I don't want them to overpower the painting. So here you see I'm adding some of those richer tones into the trees. I'm going to try and evoke some shadows, a feeling of shadows, especially towards the left and lower part of the trees, but done while the paint is wet. And in the shadow color, I'm adding a little bit more ultramarine blue to the same mixture that I had for the trees. So I'm feeling my way through the painting. The small trees that you see moving up into the city are just that, smaller versions of the same strokes moving into the city and helping to join this shape of the city with the trees in the foreground. I'm working now in the sky. Again, I'd like to keep this a functional part of the painting, and by that I mean working towards a certain end. That end being to create the shape of the city in a more dramatic way, certainly to help establish the towers that break this background, extending into the background, the shapes of the Duomo and a couple other towers left and even further left. So what I'm doing now is proceed everything with a kind of warm tone, a light sienna that I'll be using in the rooftops, by the way. And now I'm going in with a pretty strong cobalt blue, and I'm definitely cooling off the background. At the same time, I'm creating this feeling of a receding sky. And it's very wet right now, so I feel I have an opportunity to put in the mountains and shape the top of the Duomo, create the edges of the city. It's not a flat edge. The buildings, the structures, they run up the sides of the mountain. They run towards the back, so it's not a flat edge. It's a in and out type of edge, and this creates a more dynamic shape to the city as well. So I'm using a smaller brush to do this. Once I get the background nice and wet, I thicken up the paint. In this case, I'm adding more of that ultramarine blue, and I'm creating the edge of the city. At the same time, I'm creating the distant mountains. Two birds with one stone. And I continue to darken it. As long as it's glossy, as you see, it's very shiny. That tells me I can still work this wash. Once it starts to lose that shine, I know I have to be patient and wait for it to dry. But while it's shiny, I can do pretty much whatever I want. I can add, I can lift, I can adjust, I can reshape. The watercolor is at a very kind of mobile state at this point, so I can do some things with it. Well, now you see that edge of the city starting to emerge that I was talking about. Some distant buildings, definitely the shape of the Duomo, the shape of some other towers that are breaking through. And look behind that, it's all soft edges. This allows the eye to wander through and travel through the painting, and eventually will come to rest on some sharper edges. I'm hoping like the top of the Duomo, some of the buildings that break into that cool blue area behind, definitely some of the buildings in the foreground. And now the fun begins. This is a challenging part because it's so easy to get lost in the detail and try to get every window and every rooftop. And I know that's a recipe for disaster because I've done it numerous times in the past. So I'm trying to start by bringing a little extra tension to the Duomo and the buildings around the Duomo. I feel this is a center of interest that I want to key on. And as I move outward, I'm going to be thinking more about a pattern, actually. Lines and shapes that sort of describe the lay of the land, as it were. So the direction of the stroke is important. The intensity of the burnt sienna is important. The left areas, the little gaps in these strokes is important. And I'm very much thinking of a pattern rather than individual buildings. I don't know if that's obvious by the way you're watching it develop, but in my mind, I'm not even looking at my image. I'm looking at my painting, and my painting is telling me, oh, you can kind of bring this shape out. The shapes of the major shapes of the Duomo and some of these foreground buildings, yes, they're true to what I'm seeing, but a lot of the other smaller shapes, no, it's just a pattern. And I continue to watch the painting and develop it based on what it's saying to me. I like the way the Duomo's emerging. I like the way the vertical towers are presenting themselves, and some of these smaller shapes to the back left. I feel they're starting already to have a finish to them that's going to work for this painting. you can see how I'm keying on these lower left buildings also in terms of size and how they define an avenue that basically borders on the Arno. So I guess in this sort of painting where there's a lot of complication, a lot of smaller shapes, I'm trying to restrict my attention to a few, maybe 3 points, 4 points in the massive sea of buildings that I'm going to focus on. I'm keeping a lot of white in this area of the painting, and rooftops are a little bigger and a little more pigment, as they're going to kind of help me to show the sunlight, the direction of the sunlight, and how the sun is illuminating, the early morning sun is illuminating the city of Florence. The brush I'm using here is a very, very small mop brush, and it's got a nice tip. It also carries a lot of juicy pigment, so I can basically paint for going through the painting with one brush load. Don't have to refill that often, which is great because it helps me to control the tonality without remixing. Adding a shadow side to some of these buildings now, concentrating the light to the front, right, to the towers. That's my focal area. So these subtle changes, these subtle washes that I add, light washes, are placed to emphasize the light. You see me now going in with a different color. I'm going in with some of the blue that I was using in the background to create more distinctive shadows to the left side of the Duomo, under some of the rooftops, and kind of points of emphasis, areas where I want to show a little more information than, say, in other parts of the painting. And right now this is jumping out a little much. The top of the Duomo is kind of a little too bright, a little too peppy. I have a plan to add some of the distinctive light, I guess they're ribs or top parts of the Duomo to join the lower section and the top tower. But that won't come until the end of the painting, so I have to be a little patient, keep that dark there. I can always lighten it with a little paper towel and a little water. I can lighten it if I wish, but I'm going to keep it in this state for just a little longer. And I'm adding more shadows, adding more light washes to adjust the light, again focusing on that front right-hand side. You can tell now it's a little brighter, and the towers, adding some windows now, which are important elements, especially in the Duomo itself. The Duomo has these distinctive round windows that are visible from a great distance, and they are characteristic of the Duomo, so they must be there and obvious. I feel they must be obvious. Some cases we can indicate windows with just a stroke. We don't have to paint them individually, but as you saw in those buildings in the foreground, I'm adding a little bit of just a stroke for a whole line of windows. And in some ways it works a little better. Well, more of the same, adding touches here and there. I'm having a positive experience at this point because things are coming together sort of as I envisioned. It doesn't always happen with this complex subject, but I feel I'm capturing the light as I would like it to be. The trees in the foreground have worked out nicely. They're present, but they're not too obtrusive. They allow you to see the light that's falling on the city. The background certainly is receding and creating more brightness within the city. The pattern that's evolved into the buildings in the center is satisfying. It may be overdone a little bit. Here are those bending, I don't know the architectural term for it, I'm sorry, but I'm going to call them ribs for now because they're characteristic of the Duomo. And yes, I'm using a lighter color here called Jaune Brilliant, which is basically white with a bit of yellow. And it matches really closely to a lot of the yellows that I'm using in the painting so far. So it helps me to, to preserve those lines. One could use masking fluid, or one could paint around them. I find it sometimes easier and a more positive experience to paint them directly. I've preceded those with a little bit of a dark shadow color and then painted the white right on top, and I'm basically happy with the results. So now we see the finished painting, and the pattern is realized. I feel that the focal point is very strong, very clear. I like the light that's moving into the city, and overall happy with a challenging piece. As I was finishing it, I did get some ideas for trying it again, so probably I will, and I'll show that to you in the future.